There we go. Um, so, uh, yeah, coming events. Next month we are going to have a professional birding tour guide. He's worked for a few of the major international companies. Marco Valtriani, talking to us about birding and nature in Italy. After that, two long-time Pioneer Valley birders, Al and Lois Richardson, coming to talk to us in March about Bhutan, and the March meeting we will resume meeting in person. Um, so a couple of things to look forward to there. And then our last couple of meetings of the year, both professors from local institutions. First, in April, from Amherst College, we have Ethan Klotfelder, speaking about his research locally on tree swallows and black-capped chickadees. And then our final meeting with a program for the year. In June, we'll aspire to have another group picnic. But before that, in May, UMass professor Kurt Griffin talking to us about something decidedly less local, about Botswana wildlife. So as for tonight, we have one of our more bigger name speakers with us, a person who's a prolific writer, author of Living on the Wind, which was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize, author of more recently A World on the Wing, writes many pieces for publications like Living Bird and Audubon, and also a scholar of owls, and including having founded Project Snowstorm, which is, if you're noticing the image behind me, and we were all talking about Parker River Wildlife Refuge, Plum Island, and Newburyport. That's where I took this photo behind me about 10 years ago. So, but that's in relation to our speakers, the co-founder of Project Snowstorm, studying snowy owls, that very species. So, and I could go on, but you're not here to hear me talk. You're here to hear Scott Weidensaul talk. So, Scott, why don't you take it away?
Well, thank you very much, Josh. It's a pleasure to be here this evening. It's been a long time since I've spoken to the Hampshire Bird Club. It's been way too long. And I'm sorry that it's not in person, but I'm glad we get to do it this way. I'm over in New Hampshire now. The last time I spoke to you, I was living in Pennsylvania, but my wife took a job about 5 years ago with Mass Audubon, and she's kind of running the show in much of eastern Massachusetts, and we're living up in southeastern New Hampshire. So I am learning to be a rugged New Englander these days, which actually is great. New England's been like a second home for me for a long time. But what I want to talk to you about tonight is the MOTUS wildlife tracking system, which I know many of you are probably at least somewhat familiar with. MOTUS has kind of taken off in the last few years, and particularly up here in New England through an organization that I've been involved with. So bear with me for just a second here. We'll do the old screen share shuffle, and I'll give you something a little bit more pleasant to look at. Oops, come on. Why this is not, there we go. Okay. Technical stuff is always a pain in the butt. So yes, the MOTUS wildlife tracking system, and it's not hyperbole to call this a revolution in migratory research. Migration is at once one of the most important and dangerous parts of a bird's annual cycle, and it's also traditionally been, not surprisingly, the most difficult part of a bird's annual cycle to study. Most bird migration takes place after dark, not just nocturnal species like northern saw-whet owls, but even most diurnally active birds like passerines do most of their migration at night. And, for a long time, we were stuck, like staring at the disk of the full moon with a telescope to try to figure out what was going on up there. We've gotten a little bit more sophisticated over the years, but it's really been tough to figure out exactly what these, especially smaller migratory birds, are doing. Josh just mentioned Project Snowstorm, where we're putting these 40-gram GPS GSM transmitters on snowy owls that they communicate with the GPS system, satellite system overhead, so they're recording latitude, longitude, altitude, and flight speed as frequently as every 6 seconds. And an accelerometer in there, and a temperature sensor, and a cell phone modem. So a couple of times a week, it dials up and sends all of that data through the cell phone network. You can put a 40-gram transmitter on the back of a 4.5 or 5 pound owl, and it's probably not going to notice. On the other hand, if you put a 45-gram transmitter on the back of a 12-gram Kirtland's warbler, you're not going to get any migration data at all. And for the longest time, we've really been unable to track the majority of migratory birds and other small migratory animals across landscape distances because the technology was just too big and heavy. But what's happened in the last 10 years is, thanks to the brilliant people at Birds Canada, what used to be Bird Studies Canada, they took two existing technologies, these really highly miniaturized VHF radio transmitters, and paired them with automated receiver stations with directional antennas to create what has turned rapidly into a global network that is allowing us to track not only the smallest migratory birds, but also migratory insects and bats across landscape and, in some cases, continental distances. And the heart of this is these, as I said, these tiny little nanotags. Some of these are less than 1/10 of a gram, small enough not just to put on the smallest birds like hummingbirds, but on migratory butterflies like monarch butterflies, on migratory dragonflies. And this has really opened up tremendous new opportunities for us to understand the migration and movement of these migratory animals at a time when we desperately need that information, because that's what's going to give us the information that we can use to start to reverse the kinds of declines that we've been seeing over the last 50 years in the populations of many of our birds. So regardless of what you put one of these little transmitters on, these little nanotags, the original kind of nanotags that are made by a company called Low-Tech in Canada, all broadcast on the same frequency, about 166 megahertz. And they broadcast an individual identification code, basically a code and a pulse rate that identifies that transmitter as being put on a white-rumped sandpiper on James Bay, or a redbat on the shores of Lake Ontario, or a Swainson's thrush in the forests of South America. And then any of those tags can be picked up by any of these receivers. And these receiver stations basically look like somebody forgot to take down their old television antenna. They're usually some version of a 40 or 50 foot tall mast with these directional Yagi antennas, which are the same kind of antenna that biologists wave around when they're hand tracking animals from the ground. With a computer system, in remote places, there's probably a solar array to keep them going. You can mount them on the roofs of buildings. You can mount these antennas on the sides of fire towers. There's a million ways to skin this particular cat. And any of these transmitters that pass within range of any of these receivers, and the distance depends on topography, the detection distance depends on topography, it depends on weather, but on average, probably within about 15 kilometers under good conditions, you're going to pick up the transmission from that transmitter. It records that information, stores it on a computer, sends it off to Birds Canada, where it's all processed. And the number of these stations has grown exponentially. There are now about 1,800 MOTUS receiver stations, as you can see, clustered most densely in Eastern North America, but that's changing very, very rapidly. There's a rapid expansion happening in Latin America and the Caribbean, a little bit less so in Europe. My understanding is that the Europeans are a little bit too turf conscious, and they're not doing the kind of really big scale collaborations that we've been doing here in North America. And as you can see, there are a lot of stations in the Northeast. And the group that I helped found in 2015, the Northeast MOTUS Collaboration, can take some credit for that. But where we stand right now, doing this by the numbers, as I said, there's about 1,800 receiver stations in 34 countries on 5 continents, about 700 research projects using MOTUS. That's about 2,100 different partners and collaborators. These numbers, as you can imagine, change on a daily basis, but about 350 species of birds, bats, and insects have been tagged, more than 44,000 individuals. And the last time I heard, it was about 2 billion detections, but I suspect it's significantly larger than that right now. That's also generated a tremendous amount of science. Last time I checked, more than 200 peer-reviewed papers that have been published on using MOTUS data. This is opening up a window into the behavior, ecology, and conservation of migratory organisms that we've just simply never had before. And as you're going to hear a little bit later, we're now, as this network has been built out to such a significant degree, we have an opportunity to ask some really big, important questions with profound conservation implications. However, when we started the Northeast MOTUS collaboration in 2015, that's what the MOTUS network looked like. There was not much there. Now, I got into using this technology in 2012 in Pennsylvania with my good friend Dave Brinker from Maryland Department of Natural Resources. We were using it to study the local and regional movements of northern saw-whet owls in the mountains of central Pennsylvania. We set up 4 of these receiver stations, kind of equidistant from one of our banding stations. We got excited about the data that we were getting about how long the owls were sticking around and the direction that they were flying. The people at Birds Canada were looking at this technology that they were experimenting with that same year and realizing that it had tremendously greater potential. And when we found out that they had launched this MOTUS, and by the way, MOTUS, M-O-T-U-S, it's not an acronym. It doesn't stand for anything. It's from the Latin word meaning movement. They saw the value of creating this regional MOTUS network, hoping that it would become continental and perhaps eventually global. We started raising money privately through the Willistown Conservation Trust, which is one of the partners in the Northeast MOTUS collaboration, along with the Ned Smith Center for Nature and Art in Central Pennsylvania, the Carnegie Museum of Natural History in Pittsburgh, and Project Owlnet, which is a big collaboration of northern saw-whet owl banding stations around the country. We raised a couple $100,000 in private funds and then got some grant money from the state of Pennsylvania to build what was first a fence line of stations from northwest to southeast across Pennsylvania. Began filling that in over the course of the next couple of years with money that came from the Richard K. Mellon Foundation and a couple of other sources. And then in 2018, we got a large grant from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to build out the MOTUS network across the mid-Atlantic region. And this really jump-started us. The Pennsylvania Game Commission was the lead agency on this. We started building these stations by the dozens across Pennsylvania, New York, Maryland, New Jersey, and Delaware. Following that, we received another of these so-called competitive state wildlife grants from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to do the same thing across New England. And in this case, New Hampshire Audubon was the lead nonprofit partner on this. But as you can see, a wide range of other partners, Mass Audubon and Mass Division of Wildlife and Fisheries, very much involved in this. And we just within the last 6 months or so completed the build out of all of our stations across the New England region. So at this point, we've got about 160 MOTUS stations. I'm just going to run this little animation that shows starting in 2017 and through, it doesn't take us quite to the end, this takes us to about 2022, how we were able to move this project along. And notice that we're about to hit COVID here in the spring of 2020. That didn't slow us down. We continued to install stations across New York in 2020, and then starting in 2021 through the end of last year, we did the build out across New England, building essentially as much as we could fence lines running more or less east-west across these regions, so that as these birds, bats, and insects are migrating on a generally north-south track, they're going to pass through and across these fence lines. And we tried to bracket areas like the Catskills, the Adirondacks, the Green Mountains, north and south, with areas that we know are important migratory stopover sites for migratory birds. Bracket those with MOTUS stations so we can pick these birds up as they're coming in and out. We're not done yet. The big remaining hole here in the east is down in the southeast. And last year, just to show that we actually are gluttons for punishment, we got another big competitive state wildlife grant from the Fish and Wildlife Service, working with the state of Alabama this time as the lead agency to build another 40 or 50 stations across the interior of the Southeast. And we had a little bit of a hiccup in this last year where the state of Alabama, having taken this on, was undergoing a federal audit that held up all of their contract work. And so a lot of the installation work that we were hoping to do in the summer of 2023 didn't happen, but it's going to happen rather quickly. And that will kind of complete the build out across most of the East. But there's a lot of stations going in now with big regional efforts, very similar to what we did in the Northeast, in the upper Midwest, the Great Plains and Chihuahuan Desert, the Pacific Flyway, as I said, down through Latin America, just to give you a sense of what the kind of data that MOTUS generates. These are going to be numbers that are through about April of 2022, when we only had about 116 as opposed to 160 stations active. And the reason that these are not more up to date is because it takes literally days of computing power to process the millions and millions and millions and millions and millions of detections that this generates, and sort them by species and individuals and projects. And frankly, we just haven't had the time to do it again. But as of April of 2022, the Northeast region, we picked up 26.5 million detections of 140 species of birds, bats, and insects, almost 4,000 individual animals that were part of 140 distinct research projects. Those numbers have ballooned since then, as you can imagine, but just again, to give you a sense of how rapidly this has grown from 18 stations making 200 detections in 2018 to 116 stations making 26.5 million detections in 2022. It's really kind of staggering. And what's interesting is that we're not detecting necessarily what we would have expected to detect. For example, I would never in a million years have guessed that the most commonly detected species at an inland northeastern MOTUS array would be red knots. It's a coastal bird, but it's not a coastal bird when you think about it from the perspective of where these birds are actually flying on their migration. The state of Pennsylvania, where I used to live, red knot was not on their radar as a species of conservation responsibility for the state of Pennsylvania until they started seeing these maps, and they realized, oh my God, this enormous, an enormous portion of the roofa population of red knots migrates through the airspace of Pennsylvania. We may not see them from the ground, but they're there. And so things that we're doing in the state of Pennsylvania, like building ridgetop wind farms, for example, may have an impact on this federally threatened bird. And so MOTUS is giving us, as I said, a window into what these organisms are doing at times of the year and under circumstances that we have no other way of seeing what they're up to. One of the great things about MOTUS is it gives us such granularity of data, particularly in terms of the timing of migration. This is a track of a Swainson's thrush that was tagged in the summer of 2021 in New Brunswick and pinged on all of these receiver stations on its way south, where it went to Missisquoi Bay in Vermont, and then swung over into Ontario, down into northwestern Pennsylvania, across Pennsylvania, down into the Carolinas, and finally, last detection at Florida Keys National Wildlife Refuge out in the Florida Keys before it headed south to its wintering grounds in South America. If that bird were doing that flight this coming fall, there's a really good chance it would get picked up somewhere in the Caribbean or down in South America. And when you start aggregating all of that information, as this animation shows, Swainson's thrushes migrating out of Canada, heading south, you really start to get a sense of where these birds are going, what kinds of habitats they're using along the way, the timing of their migration. And the cool thing about MOTUS is it works in both directions. You can get this information about birds that are coming from known origin sites on the breeding grounds, but you can do the same thing with birds that are departing from known origin sites on the wintering grounds. These are Swainson's thrushes that were tagged at La Selva in Colombia. And this animation was obviously generated at a time when there was not a lot of MOTUS stations there in the middle part of the country. This was probably around 2017 or so. And yet we get a tremendous amount of information from these birds. now that we've created this really enormous network, the really exciting part now is to start to put this to use. When MOTUS started, it was mostly being built out on kind of a project by project basis. Somebody who wanted to study, I don't know, northern water thrushes in Quebec would put up a couple of receiver stations near their study site, and they'd study their water thrushes, but the stations would also pick up anything else that happened to be migrating through spring or fall. With the Northeast MOTUS collaboration, the group that we started, we decided to take a different track and just build the infrastructure. It's kind of like, if you build it, they will come. And now that we have so much infrastructure, we have so many receiver stations in this really robust network, we can ask some really big and really important conservation questions. For example, Sarah Kendrick, who used to work for the Missouri Department of Natural Resources, is now at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, is heading up this really ambitious wood thrush MOTUS tagging project that's launching this year, where they're working with dozens and dozens of partners across the breeding range here in North America, but also across the wintering range down in Latin America to tag. Well, originally they were hoping to tag about 600 wood thrushes. My understanding is now their target is closer to 800 to 1,000. Some of them tagged in the north, again, known origin points in the north, different breeding populations in different regions of the wood thrush range, and also doing the same thing in different regions of their wintering range in the south. And that may start to answer questions that we have, like, for example, why are wood thrushes in so many parts of their range, according to eBird trend, the latest eBird trend maps, doing really, really well? I mean, look at the significant increases in wood thrush populations in places like West Virginia, whereas here in New England, these birds are in serious trouble. Is this something that is unique to the habitat, the breeding habitat here in the Northeast? Or is it, as I think is probably more likely, that these birds in the Northeast are wintering in different areas than the birds elsewhere in their range? And so a big part of the questions that we're going to be able to answer is these questions of migratory connectivity, where these different breeding populations going. We have some sense of that from geolocator studies, but we'll also probably be able to start to answer questions about juvenile survival rate and different survival rates with different breeding populations. It gives us an opportunity to really start to answer these big questions. The reason that my friends and I started the Northeast MOTUS collaboration back in 2015 was because we selfishly wanted a robust inland northeastern or eastern MOTUS network so that we could study the movements of northern saw-whet owls. All of us involved in the Northeast MOTUS collaboration are also saw-whet owl banders. And we have been waiting very patiently for the last 8 or 9 years for this network to get big enough for us to finally launch a big saw-whet owl project. And we're doing that over the next 2 years, with privately funded money through the Ned Smith Center for Nature and Art in Pennsylvania, where I have been running their saw-whet program for about the last 27 years, but also with some money from that last competitive state wildlife grant that's funding not just building out the infrastructure in the Southeast, but also funding research programs here in the Northeast for birds like northern saw-whet owls, rusty blackbirds, and others. We're going to finally start to put this MOTUS network through its paces. We're hoping to tag somewhere between 250 and 300 northern saw-whet owls, both on the breeding grounds in the summer and during fall migration in the summer and fall of 2024 and the summer and fall of 2025. So it's exciting what we're doing with MOTUS, all the questions that we're able to answer with this. I think we're really at a point now where the really exciting stuff is just starting. Everything up to this point has been preliminary. Everything else has been a little bit of a teaser. I think we should prepare ourselves to have our socks blown off in the next 10 years when we see what the MOTUS network is able to generate for us. So with that, I'm going to I'm going to stop my screen share here, and we'll be happy to answer any questions that anybody has about MOTUS. I know that there's a lot of interest on the part of the folks in the Hampshire Bird Club for getting some additional MOTUS stations up in Western Massachusetts. I know that you folks have been in touch with my good friend and colleague, Todd Alliger, who had been with the Northeast MOTUS collaboration for many years and is now the Southeast MOTUS coordinator for the American Bird Conservancy, doing great stuff there. So yeah, I mean, if folks want to put any questions in the chat, that would be fantastic. I'll happy to answer them.
Yeah, I see Bart Baricius wants to ask a question. Bart, go on ahead.
Okay, I got it. I'm sorry. It takes a second sometimes.
No problem.
So I'm this MOTUS thing sounds very interesting, and especially for me, it seemed I've been reading articles here and there about mostly some of the large darners and a few other large dragonflies that are that migrate, but I don't know if there's a sudden amount of new information about them since the individuals seem to be able to migrate much farther than the few species of migratory butterflies. There seem to be more dragonflies, but is there any new interesting information that has come out about the dragonfly migration? I know they sometimes will that birds will follow the dragonfly in their own migrations, may follow dragonfly migration. At least that's what some people are saying.
Yeah,
Anything on that?
Yeah, like Amur falcons flying from India to Africa, following dragonfly migration across the Indian Ocean and snacking along the way. Unfortunately, I'm not tapped into the dragonfly world nearly as much as I am the bird world. I know there's been some work down in New Jersey, for example, down at Cape May with green darners. But beyond that, I'm sadly not aware of any details on new dragonfly work that's going on out there. The length of time that the transmitters last, it depends on weight, depends on battery weight. And so, as you can imagine, the transmitters that are small enough to go on a butterfly or a dragonfly or a ruby-throated hummingbird are going to have a much shorter battery life than something that would put on, like, for example, the ones we're going to be putting on saw-whet owls probably are going to last for about 2.5 years. Because a saw-whet owl is about an 80 to 100 gram bird, at least the females are, so you can put about a 2.5 gram transmitter on it. If you're putting a fraction of a gram transmitter on a small bird, a small insect, you're probably only going to get a couple of weeks of migration data. I'm more familiar with what's been going on with monarch butterflies because my colleagues at New Hampshire Audubon have been doing a lot of monarch butterfly tagging over the last 2 years. And there's been some really cool work using MOTUS to explore not just migration routes on monarchs, but for example, the folks at Guelph University in Ontario were interested in whether neonicotinoid insecticides, which we know mess up the orientation and navigational abilities of honeybees, whether those insecticides were doing the same thing to monarch butterflies. And so what Ryan Norris and his lab did was they raised monarch butterflies in captivity, raised the larvae with experimentally varied doses of neonicotinoids, from no neonics at all to really high doses. And then once those monarch butterflies emerged as adults, they tagged them and released them, and they used the MOTUS network in Ontario and Ohio and Pennsylvania to track the migration orientation of those monarch butterflies. And what they found, and I was surprised but relieved to hear this, was that the neonicotinoids did not appear to be affecting the orientation ability of the monarch butterflies to the same degree that it does honeybees. The monarchs seem to be a lot more bulletproof in that sense. Not to say that neonicotinoid insecticides are good, because they are not, and we should get rid of them, but at least that's one issue that they didn't seem to be causing. And it was, the only way we were able to tell that is because of MOTUS. On the other hand, MOTUS has also allowed researchers to see that neonicotinoids absolutely affect the migration orientation and ability of songbirds like white-throated and white-crowned sparrows that eat even just a couple of grains of seed that have been treated with Munich. So, you know, the application of these, and I realize I've gone way off track from dragonflies, and I apologize for that, Bart. But the application of this technology is, you know, the sky is kind of the limit on the kind of questions we can ask with it, or ask and answer with it.
Thank you.
Yeah, excellent. The questions are pouring into the chat, including one that got sent directly to me. So I'll read that one off to you, Scott. Asking from Derek Allard, how far does a MOTUS tower, how far away from a tower can a MOTUS detect birds? Or how close together do towers need to be for a kind of comprehensive coverage of a landscape?
So it's a little bit of an it depends question. As I mentioned earlier, it depends on the topography. This is line of sight radio frequency, so buildings and mountains and things like that block the radio signal. Weather really can degrade the signal quite a bit, but under ideal circumstances in clear sky, with a bird that's up in the air and migrating, or bat or whatever, about 15 kilometers is usually considered roughly it. So we tend to space these receiver stations about 30 kilometers apart. Now, the technology is constantly changing. I mentioned the nano tags that operate on 166 megahertz. Cellular tracking technologies down in Cape May builds what they call life tags, which operate on 464 megahertz. And the detection distances for those transmitters appear to be significantly greater. We're doing some testing right now. That's part of some of the funding we had from one of these U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service grants, was to do some testing on that. We're wrapping that up. But those transmitters require a different set of antennas. And so what we've done is we've actually gone back and retrofitted all of the 160 towers that we already put up. The ones that did not have dual frequency, dual mode capability, we went back and retrofitted them. So all of our receiver stations can pick up both the 166 and the 464 megahertz. And I'm sure that the technology is going to change on us again. It's the cool / frustrating / exciting part of working on the cutting edge like this, is because somebody's always coming up with a new idea. And we just have to, you know, figure out how you incorporate these new technologies into what we're doing. You know, one thing I realized I kind of stupidly didn't include in the presentation is the fact that all of this information, all of this tracking data is publicly available and you can see it. And in fact, if you don't mind, Josh, I'm going to screen share again, and I'm going to
Don't mind at all. Go right ahead.
I'm going to pull up the, I cannot believe I didn't do this. I'm going to pull up the MOTUS website for you. I don't know if I can, because there we go. The bar was blocking it. So MOTUS, I can't spell, MOTUS.org. This is the home page for the MOTUS Wildlife Tracking System. And you can see all of those dots. Each of those are clickable. So let's just zoom in here and just kind of, well, just pick October Mountain, which is one of our Massachusetts sites. And you can see that October Mountain has detected 18 tags. And you can click on that, and it will give you a list of all the birds, bats, and insects that have been detected there. Like, for example, here's a blue-headed vireo that was detected in October, tagged in Montreal by somebody from Environment and Climate Change Canada. It's been detected by 7 receivers. I can click on that map, and it will show me where that bird has gone. So it's tracked from Montreal down through Lake Champlain into Western Massachusetts. And the last detection was October 24th at the Tuxent Wildlife Research Center, just outside of Washington, D.C. I will warn you, this is addictive. You can spend an awful lot of time doing this, but it's a ton of fun. I just noticed there's a saw-whet owl here from Illinois, which is kind of remarkable. Let's see. maybe it's not going to generate a map for some reason. You occasionally you'll pull up a, so we'll try a different one here. Just try it one more. Try that map one more time. Mike Avera is one of the folks working with us on the big tagging project that we're going to be running out for Project Owlnet. All right, that's just gonna be fussy. Let's try. There's a hermit thrush. My internet is slow because I'm also broadcasting. I think that's part of the problem here. Well, I don't want to hold things up too much, but it's a lot of fun to explore this. And so, as I said, any of those, yeah, the fact that I'm doing a Zoom meeting is degrading my internet here. So just motus.org.
Then I just looked at that unmute, so I don't know what happened.
Oh, somebody needs to mute themselves there.
Yeah, hang on. I'll.
So anyway, I apologize for not bringing that up in the middle of my presentation as I intended to. But if there's other questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them.
Okay, I've got let's see, another one from the chat column, a bunch of kind of piled up there. What once you've put a transceiver on a bird for MOTUS tracking, how long does that how long can you continue or how long do you typically continue receiving data from that particular bird?
It all depends on the battery life, and that depends on the size. So for a bird the size of a wood thrush, and there's also some other, you can tweak things by like extending the pulse rate, which is how frequently it sends out a pulse. You know, you can have it send out a pulse every couple of seconds or every 15 seconds or every 30 seconds. The longer pulse will stretch out the life of your battery, but there's more of a chance that you might miss it as it's going past the receiver station. But you know, for a bird the size of a thrush, often the battery life is the better part of a year. So you may get its migration north in the spring and its migration south in the fall, or vice versa. We've seen that a lot. It's really cool to see with these multi-migration cycle tracks how, you know, these birds may or may not be following the same route spring and fall. In some cases, we've seen, like with some birds, that they're really, you know, it's like everybody's got their favorite rest stop on the interstate when they're making a drive that they do on a regular basis, and these birds are coming back, hitting the same spot, you know, time and time again as they're going north and south. It's where they'll have a track that they take north in the spring and a different track they take south in the fall.
All right. Let's see. I think you've addressed this one at least to some extent, but the question, are there similar regional collaborations in other areas? So
yeah,
talk about the Northeast, the Southeast, and you said it's not going so well in Europe because they're more
they just seem to be more territorial. It's a lot of it was, as it was colorfully described to me by a biologist, there's an awful lot of scent marking on the bushes over in Europe by these scientists. They don't seem to want to collaborate across country borders to the same way. But yeah, so there's, as I mentioned, there's a big collaboration going on in the upper Midwest, an 8-state collaboration that's probably about halfway through their installation. The Great Plains and Chihuahuan Desert, Matt Webb from the Bird Conservancy of the Rockies is heading that one up. The Pacific Flyway, there's big efforts out there. Birds Caribbean got a big federal North American Migratory Bird Conservation Act grant from the federal government to build out a MOTUS network across the Caribbean. And we with the Northeast MOTUS collaboration have been working really closely with Lisa Sorensen and her group in the Caribbean. We've sent our folks down there a bunch of times to run workshops to teach the folks down there how to build their own MOTUS stations. These things are relatively inexpensive. A receiver station in terms of parts is going to cost $4,000 to $6,000. It's not very expensive. It's even less expensive if you can plug it into an existing power source and run it into an Ethernet cable. You don't need to spend money on solar panels or things like that. The transmitters are also extremely inexpensive. You can spend $5,000 on a satellite transmitter, and then you have to pay additional money for the satellite time, whereas the MOTUS tags are about $275 a piece. They're inexpensive enough that it's possible to tag large numbers of individuals within a population. You're getting kind of the best of both worlds, because as this receiver network gets bigger and bigger, you get more and more granular information on where these animals are going, and and you can tag a lot of them for relatively little money and answer a lot of questions that way.
Great. Okay. Thanks to everyone for being patient. We're getting questions at a faster rate and a greater quantity than we do for most of our speakers.
I also see that Peggy has her hand up and has had her hand up for a while.
So, yeah, okay. Well, Peggy, do you want to step in and ask your question?
Yeah, it's just that I saw a demo of tagging monarchs, Louise Amatis down in the Cape May thing. I don't know if that was a MOTUS project, but as soon as she tagged the monarch, we could see it on our app that went with it. And then she could see Betsy and Elizabeth. They name everyone that they tag, and we could see where they are and actually locate them within Cape May.
That might be using one of CTT's node technologies, where they're able to track these things on a kind of a hyper local basis.
Yes, because the tags were not $275 a piece. They were like this big.
Yeah. Well, size can some of the really tiny hyper miniaturized ones can actually be more expensive than the bigger ones.
My question is, if you tagged a bird, how soon can you start detecting it?
As soon as it goes past one of the towers, as soon as it goes past a receiver station.
So if you have the number or the GPS, however you identify it, you could go to motus.org and start to see where it's going.
Yep. Yeah. So for example, if the folks at Drumlin Farm with Mass Audubon were tagging northern saw-whet owls the last year or two at Drumlin Farm, where they have a receiver station, and as soon as that tag was activated and the owl was released, it was showing up on Drumlin Farm's receiver station. Now there can be a little bit of a lag. It depends, because some of these receiver stations are not connected either cellularly or to Wi-Fi. There are some in remote places where we still have to go in and download the data a couple of times a year off an SD card. So in those cases, but the vast majority of them use what's called a sensor station, which is the guts of it basically communicate with the cell phone network and sends all of the data automatically on a continuous basis up to Birds Canada. There's a bit of a processing lag in there. I don't know if it's a matter of hours or days, but once the animal's tagged, it's going to show up really quickly.
It's pretty amazing. Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, from Bill Randolph, we have, let's see, you already talked about how long the tags persist, but he asks, can you review the process of attaching a tag to a bird? How do you go about it?
Sure, it depends on the bird. Most of the songbirds, the tags go on with an elastic beading material, like elastic necklace material that kids would make beaded necklaces out of. It's called stretch magic, and it's like a fraction of a millimeter, and it's stretchy, and it's just two little loops that go around the upper part of the bird's leg, and the transmitter sits on the synsacrum, which is the flat part at the base of the bird's spine, and the antenna extends back off the tail, and so I'm going to embarrass myself. I'm going to stand up here. It goes like right up here in this part, high up in bird's body. I can't believe I did that on camera.
But we were recording that too, Scott.
Yes, I know. I understand that. This will come back and haunt me at some point, Josh. Um,
We've seen
there
worse.
there are, yes. Hey, I could tell you stories. I've done talks where people have gotten naked on my talks because they didn't realize that was a Massachusetts bird club that shall remain unnamed. Somebody didn't know their camera was on. Anyway, we are actually going to be using backpack harnesses on northern saw-whet owls because we found out it's really hard to put those leg loop harnesses on owls that have talons. It's easy to do it on a wood thrush or a mourning warbler or something like that, but the saw-whet owls are a pain in the neck to do that on. And there's some indication that those leg loop harnesses that work really, really well, they're very effective and very safe on songbirds, may not be a really good choice for small raptors like kestrels and saw-whet owls. In fact, Mass Division of Wildlife, they've been doing a lot of work with American kestrels with MOTUS, and they're using specially made 3D printed harnesses for the kestrels that fit really, really well on the torso of the bird, that have done a really great job of keeping these CTT made solar powered life tags on the birds in a comfortable, safe place. So.
Right, excellent. Let's see. Next question we have here. Does MOTUS gather information relating bird migration to weather patterns? So
Well, not directly. All it's doing is recording, what receiver station that particular transmitter has pinged off of. But obviously, you can take that data because it's often very granular data. You can tell exactly how many minutes, hours, and seconds it took for a bird to get from point A to point B, and you can start to relate that to weather. And in fact, one of the things that we're hoping to do with this saw-whet owl project, this is the OwlNet saw-whet project is going to be run by a master's student from our Northeast MOTUS collaboration, working at the University of Delaware with Dr. Jeff Bueller in his aeroecology lab, where Jeff and his students have done some really amazing stuff with radar ornithology and weather. And so we're really hoping that we're going to be able to start to fold in weather in terms of movement and migrations in northern saw-whet owls. So yeah, that's the sort of thing that MOTUS lends itself to very well.
all right. Kathy and Jeff Hour asking, are you familiar with MOTUS being used in mortality studies, which you've covered some of that a bit already, but
Yes, they're definitely absolutely being used in that, and some other interesting things. For example, Luke DeGroot at Powder Mill Nature Reserve in Pennsylvania, who's part of our Northeast MOTUS collaboration, has had a really cool project where they've been studying the survival and migration orientation of birds that have survived window strikes. We know billions of birds fly into windows every year. Many of them die immediately, but many of them survive and fly off. And one of the things Luke has been looking at for his PhD is whether those birds suffer, the birds that have survived window collisions, whether they suffer any kind of problems in migration orientation. And so, I keep saying that the sky's the limit with the questions that we can ask with MOTUS. And whenever somebody comes up with an idea like that, it's like, duh, why didn't I think of that? There's an ability to delve into all of these questions about ecology and biology and migration and survival and mortality that we never had an opportunity to do before.
yeah. So
Can you tell I'm excited about this?
Absolutely, it's awesome. And so our next question, kind of expounding a little further on the mortality question. Has there been data on predators ingesting MOTUS transmitters? And does ingesting the transmitter have any impact on a predator that swallows it?
I'm not aware of that. I'm sure it has happened, probably with owls, because owls don't really, that they're not the most delicate of diners. Let's put it that way. Everything kind of goes down in great big chunks. I don't know about that with MOTUS. I had a northern saw-whet owl that we were using standard VHF radio receivers on. There you go. Man, you're like the man of a million owls here, Josh. Um,
That
we
one's
had a,
too
we had a
big.
northern
I'll
saw-whet
go.
owl in south central Pennsylvania years ago that we were doing a roost habitat study on, and a great horned owl got it, and we found the transmitter still transmitting in a great horned owl pellet. So I am not too concerned about that causing any problem for the predator. I mean, raptors are capable of choking down and bringing back up again some really god awful stuff. I mean, if I had time, I could pull out the picture I have of a snowy owl pellet that is primarily the entire leg of a red-throated loon that went down in one piece and apparently came back up again in one piece with a lot of stuff wrapped around it. So owls are pretty good at getting rid of that stuff.
Wow, I'm not sure about this picture I put up here. It's making
Well,
my face.
you're upside down right now.
Oh, is that what's happening to
That's
me?
what's happened. Yeah.
Um, all right. Now I know someone in the audience, I think it may have been Anthony Hill, mentioned that we do have a tower in Hadley
Yep.
at the Silvio Conte National Wildlife Refuge.
Yep. And if you go there, you will see a lot of tracks of barn swallows, because they're doing a lot of barn swallow research there at the Silvio Conte Wildlife Refuge.
Okay. And I see another post later. Oh, also by Anthony that the state parks agency declined to put a tower up on Mount Holyoke at Skinner State Park. So do you know, in our area in the valley or in Hampshire County, are there other towers in process? I know our club's conservation committee is trying to get another one rolling in our area, but
Well, I knew about that. That's the only one I'm aware of. I mean, we're not looking to put up any more ourselves. We have 160 towers that we have to take care of now, and that's a little bit daunting because they require maintenance. But we're happy to help anybody else that's interested. And in fact, one of the things that we can do is do a view shed analysis where and it takes a lot of computing power. It takes a lot of time to run these viewshed analyses through a GIS. But you give us a location, we can generate a visualization of where that location is, how much of the 360-degree horizon you're going to see, how much blockage there's going to be. For obvious reasons, we tend to want to see these receiver stations go in on high, the highest, clearest, 360-degree view it's possible, although not too high. For example, putting them on the high peaks of the Adirondacks, where you've got tremendous issues with snow and ice loading, that becomes a problem. So you're always kind of compromising a little bit. People sometimes look at our map and say, well, what? I got this big hole there in the Adirondacks, all those high mountains. Getting the equipment to the top of something like Mount Marcy can be a bit of a challenge, even if we had permission to do it. So
I see Bruce Hart holding his hand up on the screen there. Bruce, I think, is on the club's conservation committee. Bruce, do you have info for us? Oh, Bruce, I think you're muted, or at least I'm not hearing. I see your mouth moving. I'm not hearing anything. Oh well. Maybe you can text in your update or something, or but in any case, okay. What else do we have? We have another question. Bill Randolph asking about using smartphones as a receiver. I'm guessing the range on that would be pretty limited, but
yeah, I mean, I know there's some new technology coming out that's based off cell towers. CTT has some tags that basically triangulate off cell towers, which have advantages if the animal is in an area with a lot of cell towers. I mean, one of the questions I get a lot, and I'll just anticipate a question here. People will often ask, well, is this going to make banding obsolete? Is this going to make satellite transmitters obsolete? Is this going to make, all these other techniques we have? There's many folks may be aware of what's known as the Icarus Initiative, which the Max Planck Institutes in Germany have been pioneering. It's a satellite transmitter form that operates off a receiver station on the International Space Station, or at least it did. The antenna was on the Russian module of the ISS, and when the Ukraine war broke out and everybody kind of shut the door on Russia, Russia said, "Well, okay, fine," and they turned it off. So all of these different tracking technologies, all of these different research techniques like banding, all have their advantages, they all have their disadvantages, and they're all complementary. None of these technologies are going to replace other approaches and other techniques and other technologies. They've all got pluses and minuses. And as I said before, it's exciting because there's constantly new ideas being rolled out and new ways to study these birds. And it's cool to get this information, and it's great that we're learning these things from an academic perspective. But what I'm excited about is it's finally giving us the information that we need, maybe just in the nick of time, to turn the tables on these long-term declines that we've been seeing in these birds. I think we're really at a point in the next 10 years where we're going to be able to understand where the pinch points are and start to address them from a conservation perspective, and maybe start to reverse the declines that we've been living with for so long.
You had compared the MOTUS antenna earlier to some of the handheld ones that people used to use which I remember using those tracking desert tortoises when I was when I was a teenager. What about are there people trying to use like sort of portable MOTUS towers they can carry with them? And
there absolutely are. You can hand track with these things. Yeah, I mean those Yagi antennas that we have mounted on the receiver stations are exactly like the handheld Yagis that you used when you were tracking desert tortoises. It's exactly the same principle. It's a directional antenna. The data we get, you can tell with these 4 antennas, aimed in the cardinal points that the transmitter came from such and such a direction and went off in such and such a direction. It gives us a tremendous granularity of data. But yeah, there are portable receiver stations. You can also use omnidirectional antennas. One of the tricky parts with these Yagi antennas, because they are directional, they do a really good job of picking up transmitters that are up in the airspace out away from you. They're not going to pick up anything that's right below you. So some of the early folks experimenting with MOTUS would set up, for example, a MOTUS station in a marshland on the western shore of Maryland in order to track soar rails, and tagged a bunch of soar rails that they didn't pick up because the receiver's looking out that way and the soars are all right down there. So they switched to an omnidirectional and had no problem whatsoever. So, and again, a million different ways to skin these cats.
Okay. Let's see, from Derek Allard, asking, as AI improves, do you see MOTUS towers evolving to operate without a receiver on the bird? And Derek, I don't know if you want to chime in yourself. There's sort of a lengthy amount of detail following up on that question, but
yeah, I'm not sure I understand the question, Derek.
Yeah, I was just thinking, we have, Cornell has the sound IDs now, and AI is being able to do a lot of
like Merlin.
identification, on Merlin and things like that. And I was just wondering, as things evolve, instead of a tower and a receiver, could it be more of an audio recorder and a video recorder that does the work and let's AI do the identification instead of the tag, I guess is my
Oh,
question.
sure. And in fact, we're very close to that right now. But again, I think that's complementary. What that's going to tell you is that a certain number of individuals of a certain species are passing there. It's not going to tell you where a specific individual from a specific breeding population or specific wintering population has gone point to point.
Right.
So, these layers of big data that we're getting from observational databases like eBird, and I think this next coming wave, as you say, of audio and vocalization data and radar data and MOTUS data, all of that stuff layered one on top of another is just tremendously exciting. I'm really excited. Next week, down in West Virginia at the National Conservation Training Center, is going to be the fourth Road to Recovery conference that were started in the wake of the 3 Billion Birds Lost paper that came out in 2019, organized by Ken Rosenberg and Pete Mara and a bunch of other people involved in that paper. These conferences have all been virtual to this point. This will be the first in-person one to, fill in these information gaps, figure out where the problems are, start to address them on a species by species and guild by guild basis to bring back these declining groups of birds. And I cannot wait to hear what people have been coming up with over the last couple of years, using all of this information.
Excellent. Thank you.
And a couple of updates from the Hampshire Bird Club Conservation Committee. Apparently they are looking at adding a MOTUS tower in Worthington. It is one of the hill towns in Western Hampshire County. So more or less on a line in between the October Mountain Tower and our local Hadley tower at the Conte Refuge.
Oh, that'd be fantastic.
Yeah, that'd be
'Cause
excellent.
I have to tell you that October Mountain site was probably the most complicated series of hoops that we had to jump through in all 160 stations that we put up anywhere in the East. That was Todd Alliger, I think, went prematurely gray working on that project. But it's been a great site. It's been a really good site. So getting another one up in between would be fantastic.
Okay, one more. This is the last one that's been posted in the chat. So anyone else who wants to ask one that hasn't yet, get typing. But this one from Bart Baricius asking, you had talked about the MOTUS receivers. How many get mounted on their own tower versus being mounted on pre-existing like cell towers and such?
I couldn't begin to guess how many are freestanding versus mounted on buildings versus mounted on fire towers versus mounted on commercial towers. We just work with whatever's easiest at that particular site. We've tended to avoid commercial cell towers for a couple of reasons. One is that we generally have to hire bonded installers to do the climbing rather than us doing it ourselves. And we have found that those bonded climbers don't always necessarily know what they're doing, and we sometimes then have them go back and redo what they did the first time. The other thing that we have discovered with some of the commercial towers, especially here in the Northeast, is that they not surprisingly, they get a lot of ice on them. And when that ice starts to fall, it often just shears off our antennas. We learned that lesson the hard way. It's been an interesting learning curve. We have learned over the years, we just over-engineer the crap out of these things because bad things are going to happen. And sometimes just the strangest things happen. We've had receiver stations that were completely destroyed by black bears for no reason that we can think other than the black bears just were bored that day. We have a spot in northwestern Pennsylvania that we call Porcupine Hell. It's out in the middle of an open field in northwestern Pennsylvania. And for some reason, the porcupines just gravitate there and have just chewed that station to pieces over the years. We've had to go back and keep replacing turnbuckles and moving the turnbuckles higher up and putting up baffles, and they just keep coming. And it's, it's not like that's the only place where there are porcupines in our coverage area, but they just, for some reason there, the porcupines are just, they just have it out for us. So it's been an interesting learning experience. I am not the person who's out in the field doing the installations. I'm the person who goes out and helps because they can say, Scott, pick that up and carry it over there. You don't want me installing your MOTUS station if you want it to work right. But we've got good folks like Dave Brinker and Todd Allagher and others that have worked out the mechanics and the engineering on this pretty well.
All right. Well, that is, I have to say, Scott, I think your slideshow and talk initially was one of the shortest ones we've had, and your question and answer period following was easily the longest I can remember. So,
well, I intentionally kept it kind of short because my experience has been that there's always a lot of questions. So I hope nobody was disappointed with the slideshow portion of it, but I hope I made up for it with the questions.
oh, absolutely. That was fantastic. And if we were in person, you would definitely be getting a standing ovation right now.
Well, that's very kind of you. This has been so much fun. I really appreciate it. It's been wonderful to be back with the Hampshire Bird Club. I hope we can do it again sometime in person. I'm not right next door, but I'm not nearly as far away as I was when I was living in Pennsylvania. So maybe we can do it in person one of these days.
Definitely. We will work that out. So.
All right. Well,
thank you for coming out tonight, everybody. And thank you once again, Scott, for excellent program.
My pleasure. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Trying to figure out how to stop the recording. There we go.